In just a few short years, the German Panzerwaffe underwent a radical mutation. The war that began with light, nimble tanks ended with bizarre steel monoliths, enormous armor, overwhelming firepower. The logic was primitive: more is better. The transformation started with a simple subtraction. To understand these machines, you have to look at the turret, or rather the lack of one. Before the invasion of Poland, German engineers took a standard tank chassis and stripped it. They removed the rotating turret. They welded a fixed armored superstructure directly to the hull. Inside, they mounted a short-barreled 75mm gun. The result was the Sturmgeschütz, an assault gun designed for one task: infantry support. But the war changed. Enemy armor became thicker. Soviet and Allied tanks became more numerous. The low-velocity guns of the early years were no longer enough. The military needed hunters. They swapped the short guns for high-velocity anti-tank cannons. This shift created the Panzerjäger, the tank hunter. Building a rotating turret was a nightmare for a war economy. It required complex ball bearings, precise gear rings, and thousands of additional man-hours. A fixed casemate was different. Workers lowered the heavy gun into the hull. They welded the fixed steel plates around it. The gun was locked in place. To aim left or right, the entire vehicle had to turn. This trade-off was a cold calculation. A fixed casemate saved 30% of production time per vehicle. It was cheaper. It was faster. It was a factory manager's dream and a crew's tactical nightmare. By 1945, this obsession with cost over ergonomics reached its peak. The Reich was churning out Jag Tigers, 71-ton monsters that could barely move but carried the heaviest guns of the war. The German High Command became addicted to this shortcut. They eventually applied the turretless concept to almost every tank chassis in production. Only the Tiger I remained untouched. By April 1944, the Reich's obsession with cost-cutting birthed the mobile coffin, the Jagdpanzer 38T. Soldiers called it the Hetzer. It was a brutal compromise of steel and bone. How do you fit 4 grown men into a space designed for 2? German engineers simply sat the loader on the gunner's lap. The machine stood barely 7 feet tall. It was a ghost in the hedgerows, a nightmare for Allied tankers who never saw it coming. But inside, the crew lived in a crushing, airless box. The internal volume was nearly half that of a standard medium tank. To the engineers, it was efficiency. To the crew, it was a tomb. The layout ignored human physics. The driver sat up front, alone. Behind him, the gunner and loader were crushed together on the left side of the massive 75mm cannon. In any other tank, they sat on opposite sides to breathe. Here, they shared the same square meter. Imagine the chaos of a firefight. The cabin fills with choking cordite. The loader reaches across the hot recoil guard to grab a shell from the opposite wall. He is tangled in limbs. He is fighting his own teammates for an inch of movement. By the end of the war, 2,500 of these machines rolled off the lines. But the physical struggle was secondary to the isolation. Every crewman was effectively blind. Most tanks had poor visibility, but the Hetzer took it to a level of total sensory deprivation. The commander could not see the very ground his driver was crossing. The crew operated in a state of permanent, lethal darkness. This engineering nightmare didn't start with malice. It started with a calculator. The transition to the cramped death trap of the Jagdpanzer 38T began with a masterclass in German accounting. The math was brutal. A single Tiger tank cost the Reich 300,000 Reichsmarks. A Panzer IV cost 100,000, but a Stug? 70,000. For the price of one heavy tank, Berlin could put a 4-vehicle platoon of assault guns into the field. It was a bargain the crumbling economy couldn't ignore. Engineers stripped the turret from the proven Panzer III chassis. They replaced complex moving parts with a fixed steel casemate. The result was a silhouette lower than a standing man. How do you hit what you can't see? You don't. From the steppes of Russia to the sands of North Africa, the Stug vanished into the tree line. It waited. Its high-velocity 75mm gun could punch through the face of almost any Allied tank. Superior optics allowed the crew to strike first and strike from distance. Without the weight of a heavy turret, the drivetrain didn't snap under its own mass. The Stug became the most reliable tracked vehicle in the Wehrmacht. It stayed in the fight while the Panthers rotted in repair shops. To fix the thin side armor, they hung steel plates called Schürzen away from the hull. These skirts forced Soviet anti-tank rounds to tumble and lose kinetic energy before impact. The same simple sheets of metal later neutralized American bazookas and British PIAT projectiles. The low profile of the Sturmgeschütz III was a ghost on the battlefield. It didn't look like a Predator, it was an assault gun, built to blast bunkers and crush machine gun nests. It followed the infantry where heavy artillery couldn't reach. But the Eastern Front rewrote the mission. The High Command was explicit: do not use it as a tank destroyer. They feared the casemate was too vulnerable. The gun was a short-barreled 75mm howitzer. It fired low-velocity shells. It was a tool for demolition, not duels. Then came Operation Barbarossa. The T-34 and KV-1 shattered German expectations. Soviet armor was thicker. Their numbers were endless. To survive, the Reich stripped the Stug of its purpose. They installed the long-barreled L-43 gun, then the lethal L-48. The original short guns didn't go to waste. They were bolted onto Hanomag half-tracks, nicknamed Stummel. Acrid smoke from burning Soviet steel became the Stug's new environment. A machine designed to fight concrete became the greatest tank killer of the war. It destroyed 30,000 Soviet tanks. This was more than any Tiger or Panther, more than any Allied vehicle in history. The men inside made the difference. Kurt Nispel, the Reich's deadliest ace, racked up many of his 160 kills in the cramped cabin of a Stug. They fought from the shadows of the terrain. The efficiency was cold. Near Leningrad in 1943, a single battalion of 41 vehicles engaged a Soviet tidal wave. They eliminated 221 T-34s and KV-1s. The Germans lost 13. Success on the Eastern Front hit a systemic collapse. Germany was running out of tanks. The solution was a surrogate that eventually devoured the original. Who replaced the fallen Panzer elite? Not tankers. The crews of the Sturmgeschütz were artillerymen. They wore field gray instead of the Panzer black. They were trained to support infantry, not to hunt armor. Yet by 1944, these gunners became the most efficient killers in the Wehrmacht. The math of total war dictated the design. A Stug was cheaper. It was faster to build. It lacked a rotating turret, but it performed. As the Panzer battalions bled out, the surrogates took their place. The industry shifted to the Panzer IV chassis. It was robust. It was available. On this foundation, they built the Stug 4. When Allied bombs gutted the factories, the Germans began a desperate recycling. They scavenged hulls. They bolted on different guns. The variants grew more aggressive. Engineers mounted a 105mm howitzer onto the chassis, creating the Stu-42. It provided massive high-explosive fire for a fragmenting army. On the ruined factory floors, workers combined mismatched hulls and guns to keep the front from folding. When the economy collapsed, the Reich unleashed 16-ton machines built on a foundation of lethal compromises. Engineers took a 10-ton Czech chassis and buried it under 6 extra tons of steel and gunpowder. The front plate was a lie of safety. 60 millimeters of sloped armor could deflect an Allied shell, but the illusion shattered at the flanks. The sides measured only 20 millimeters. The roof was a mere 8. Soviet infantry didn't need tanks to kill a Hetzer. They had 2 million anti-tank rifles. A soldier pulled the trigger. The high-velocity round punched through the side like a needle through paper. Inside, the cramped cabin turned into a whirlwind of jagged fragments. Even an American .50 caliber machine gun could shred the hull. The roof offered no protection from standard rifle fire from a second-story window. Could the crew see the threat? They were blind. The narrow vision slits turned close-quarters combat into a guessing game. The machine groaned under its own weight. 16 tons sat on a frame designed for 10. Steel leaf springs screamed. Look at the early models. The nose dived toward the mud. The front was so heavy from the gun and the thick plate that the entire vehicle sagged visibly. The suspension didn't just vibrate, it disintegrated. A few forced marches turned the transmission into a box of broken teeth. The engine strained, but the physics were unforgiving. It was too slow to keep pace with motorized infantry units. 1943. The German war machine was bleeding out. On the Eastern Front, Soviet steel was crushing everything in its path. New T-34s and KV series tanks made the old Panzers look like toys. Berlin needed a solution. Fast, cheap, deadly. They looked at the scrap heaps. The factories held thousands of Czechoslovakian 38T chassis. These light tanks were relics, thin-skinned and outdated. But the hulls were there. The factories were running. The plan was simple. Strip the turret, widen the base, weld a fixed steel casemate on top. No rotating turret meant less weight and more speed. It also meant a lower silhouette. This was the birth of a predator, a scavenger made of recycled parts. The engineers took the 7.5-centimeter Pak-39. It was a masterpiece of ballistics, a high-velocity killer. At 1,000 meters, it could punch through almost any Allied hull. It was the sting of a wasp on the body of a beetle. But the marriage of a heavy gun and a tiny chassis was a mechanical nightmare. Inside the factory, the air stayed thick with the smell of old grease and welding sparks. Workers forced the massive breach into a narrow slit in the armor. Space vanished. The gun was offset to the right. It was literally squeezed in. This physical constraint dictated the tactics. The Pak-39 could only swing 11 degrees to the right. To the left, the situation was worse. The heavy breach hit the internal wall almost instantly. The entire weapon was paralyzed by its own armor. The crew was trapped in a machine that couldn't look aside. To track a target moving across the field, the driver had to pivot the entire 16-ton vehicle. One wrong move, and the tracks would grind against the earth, giving away their position. The gun could only traverse 5 degrees to the left. Engineering for the Hetzer didn't just save steel, it sacrificed the crew's eyes. To keep the silhouette low and the cost lower, designers stripped away the commander's cupola. The interior became a steel coffin of blind spots. The driver stared through a single tiny slit. The gunner saw nothing but his crosshairs. The loader lived in total darkness. The commander was the only one who could see. He relied on a small scissor periscope. But there was a catch. To get a clear view, he had to stand up through the hatch. His head became the highest point on the vehicle, a perfect target for snipers. One veteran described the experience as fighting with a blindfold and earmuffs. The machine was blind to its own flanks. A 270-degree dead zone surrounded the hull. If infantry approached from the side, the crew simply didn't know. They couldn't turn the gun fast enough. They couldn't even look out a side port. Their only defense was a remote-controlled MG-34 on the roof. It used a primitive system of cables and pulleys. The gunner fired from inside, but he couldn't aim. He just sprayed bullets into the void. Then came the reloading. The drum held 50 to 75 rounds. A few bursts and the gun went silent. The remote solution ended there. The metallic clang of an empty drum signaled a death sentence. To reload, a soldier had to unlatch the hatch. He had to climb out onto the roof while under fire. He had to fumble with the mount while exposed to every rifleman in the tree line. The engineering was a cruel joke. On paper, the machine was a predator. In reality, it couldn't even point its gun at a threat 10 meters to the left. By late 1944, the German General Staff looked at production charts and saw a miracle. Thousands of flat, jagged hulls rolled off the assembly lines. On the maps of Berlin, these dots represented a new wall of steel. But on the actual front, the map was collapsing. Allied tanks flooded the horizon. From the east and the west, the weight of mass production crushed the Reich's industrial illusions. The Hetzer was a desperate answer to an impossible question. Could a cheap, recycled chassis stop the combined output of Detroit and the Urals? The answer lay in the dirt. In rare, well-executed ambushes, a single crew could claim dozens of Allied kills. They fired from the shadows, invisible and lethal. But these local successes were ghosts. They couldn't dent the thousands of Shermans and T-34s pouring through the gaps. Historians today admire the numbers. They praise the innovative low profile and the efficiency of the Hetzer concept. But the spec sheet ignores the screaming. It forgets the smell of burnt oil and the terror of men trapped in a blind, cramped box. Behind every impressive statistic stood a boy who couldn't turn his head to see the enemy. We must look past the sleek armor and remember the cost of these mechanical compromises. The Reich traded its soldiers' lives for better quarterly reports. Construction of the first prototypes began in a fever of desperation. In late 1944, the German General Staff reached the peak of engineering cynicism. They took the blind, cramped shell of the Hetzer and stripped away its only real defense, the long-range cannon. In its place, they installed a flame projector. 50 crews received a death sentence in the form of the Panzer 38T. The machine carried no shells. Instead, the hull was packed with pressurized tanks of hydrocarbon mix. Imagine the heat. The stench of fuel leaked into the tiny cabin. Behind the thin armor, the crew sat centimeters away from a chemical bomb. To fire, they had to drive within 60 meters of the enemy. Point-blank range. Every Allied rifleman and anti-tank gunner prioritized the flame tank. One hit meant a localized sun would ignite inside the steel box. The risk was too much for even the most indoctrinated soldiers. Many crews simply stopped. They climbed out and left the engines running. They abandoned the machines intact, refusing to enter a rolling crematorium. In 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising, the Polish resistance found one of these abandoned steel traps. They didn't fear the fire. The insurgents captured the vehicle and used the German weapon to hold a barricade against its former masters. By the time the Panzer appeared, the Reich's obsession with cheap production had officially crossed into sadism. The success of the 38T platform was a lie written in charred remains. The Polish resistance successfully operated the captured tank, designated Schwat, against German armored units. While crews burned in the cramped death traps of Warsaw, Reich engineers obsessed over a different extreme. They pivoted from desperate economy to a new god, the Pak-43 L-71. It was a monster of ballistics. The muzzle velocity defied previous limits. At 2,000 meters, this weapon punched through 132 millimeters of steel. Contrast the legendary Tiger I. At point-blank range, just 100 meters, its gun penetrated 120 millimeters. The new weapon was more lethal at 2 kilometers than its predecessor was at the distance of a city block. It surpassed the power of a heavy tank in every measurable metric. The loaders felt the change first. The shell for the new 88 was a giant. The cartridge case was longer, wider, and significantly heavier than the standard Tiger ammunition. Sliding it into the breech required raw strength. When the trigger pulled, the roar was deafening. The kinetic energy at 2 kilometers exceeded the energy of the original Tiger's gun, fired at zero range. Berlin had a problem. The Tiger II carried this gun, but it was a logistical nightmare. It was too slow, too expensive, too complex for a crumbling empire. The military needed a dedicated tank killer, a machine capable of cracking the thick, sloped holes of the Soviet IS-2 from distances where the enemy couldn't even see the muzzle flash. Early attempts failed the test of the front lines. The Nashorn carried the gun, but lacked the skin to survive a return shot. Its silhouette was a beacon for Soviet gunners. The Ferdinand went the other way, overcompensating with massive weight that crushed its own transmission. Engineers searched for a middle ground. The ambitious attempt to mount the giant Pak-43 L-71 onto a mobile tank platform opened Pandora's box and led to the creation of the Jag Panther. Every 200 kilometers, the transmission disintegrated. Metal gears sheared under 75 tons of dead weight. This was the Jag Tiger. It was heavier than a modern American M1 Abrams, yet it relied on an engine designed for a tank 20 tons lighter. The 600 horsepower motor screamed, fighting a losing battle against gravity and mud. The armor was a fortress. 225 millimeters of steel sloped at 75 degrees. On the battlefield, it was frontal invincibility. But this protection became a cage. The machine was too heavy for most European bridges. It moved at a crawl, topping out at 12 miles per hour. Reliability did not exist. When the transmission snapped in the mud, the nightmare began for the field mechanics. They stood in the freezing slush, staring at a mechanical paradox. To reach the broken gears, they couldn't just open a hatch. They had to remove the entire main gun first. Mechanics labored for days to perform a basic repair. Heavy cranes were non-existent at the front lines. The crews often chose a different path. They set demolition charges and abandoned the monsters where they sat. The crisis reached the top of the German command. Panic set in at the assembly lines. For the first time, engineers traveled from the factories directly to the crumbling front to witness the failure. Hitler demanded the impossible in the summer of 1943. He wanted a monster. Soviet heavy armor was evolving, and the legendary 88mm guns were losing their edge. The solution? Mount a naval-sized cannon on a tank chassis. How do you force a 12.8-centimeter Pak-44 onto tracks? It was a weapon designed for ships and heavy flak positions. Too long, too heavy. To make it work, engineers had to cut the King Tiger chassis and extend the hull by nearly 2 feet. The escalation was absurd. In 1939, the Wehrmacht relied on a 37mm door knocker. 2 years later, they moved to 50 and 75mm. Now they were jumping to a 128mm Titan. It was a leap of desperation. Earlier prototypes like the Sturer Emil and Dicker Max proved such guns could move. But the military had dismissed them as impractical. Hitler ignored the warnings. He obsessed over the Maus super heavy tank, but that 180-ton project was a fantasy. He needed the gun on the front line immediately. The King Tiger platform was the only option left. Designers stripped the hull. They stretched the steel frame. Every inch of added length strained the suspension to its breaking point. The final design required an extension of the original hull by exactly 2 feet. The extra hull length was a heavy price for a 7-meter barrel. It turned the crew's life into a mechanical nightmare. Every jolt of the suspension was a threat. On uneven ground, the massive steel tube vibrated with such violence it warped the gun mountings. The weapon literally shook itself out of alignment. To save the optics, the crew had to lock the barrel into a massive external travel brace. Listen to the sound, the heavy metallic clang of the lock being released before a fight. If the loader forgot this step, the first shot could shatter the internal mechanisms. Inside, the space was a tomb of steel and cordite. The 128mm gun used separate loading ammunition. One man could not handle it alone. 2 loaders worked in a frantic, exhausting synchronization. One lifted the 28-kilogram projectile. The other followed with the massive brass casing. They shoved the steel into the breech, then the propellant. It was slow. It was brutal, but the result was absolute. At 3 kilometers, the shell hit with the force of a falling building. It didn't matter if it was high explosive or armor piercing. No Allied tank could survive the kinetic shock. Despite this power, the beast was nearly blind and often toothless. The entire massive casemate held a total of only 38 shells, while loaders on the Jagdtiger hauled 28-kilogram shells. German engineers attempted to fix the mistakes of the past. They needed a balance. The 70-ton Ferdinand was a slow, impractical fortress. It crushed bridges and broke its own transmission. At the other end, the Hetzer was too thin, its 75mm gun already losing the arms race. The solution seemed simple. Take the proven Panther chassis, weld a fixed armored casemate on top, mount the lethal Pak-43. This was the Sonderkraft Fahrzeug 173. The world would know it as the Jagdpanther. Could the industry deliver? Production began in January 1944. It was a race against extinction. By mid-year, the German war machine was gasping for air. Allied bombers turned factories into craters. The plan called for 160 machines every month. It was a fantasy. By June, only 46 Jagd Panthers had left the assembly lines. The gap between ambition and reality widened with every air raid. Material shortages and a vanishing workforce strangled the project. By the end of the war, the total output reached only 415 units. Those 415 Jagd Panthers were not just machines. They were steel traps for 5 men. Inside the sloped hull, the illusion of space vanished. 5 crewmen occupied the cramped superstructure. The commander, driver, gunner, loader, and radio operator lived in a world of sharp angles and oil. At the center sat the massive breech of the 88mm gun. 60 heavy shells lined the walls, leaving barely enough room to breathe. When the gun fired, the air turned toxic. Acrid cordite smoke filled the unventilated cabin. The gunner squinted through his optics, struggling with a traverse limited to just 12 degrees. Beyond that narrow arc, the entire 46-ton beast had to pivot on its tracks. The protection was a gamble. The frontal armor plate was 80 millimeters thick. Sloped at 55 degrees, it provided an effective barrier of over 130 millimeters. It was nearly impenetrable from 3,000 meters, but the designers ignored the vertical. The floor and roof were thin plates of 16 to 25 millimeters. One well-placed mortar shell or a single anti-tank mine would turn the interior into a pressure cooker of shrapnel. The Maybach V12 engine pushed this iron house to 46 kilometers per hour. Despite the weight, it matched the top speed of a standard American Sherman. 46 kilometers per hour meant nothing when the transmission turned to glass. The Jagd Panther was a surgical instrument. In the hands of an 18-year-old conscript, it was a liability. These boys had never driven a car. Under combat stress, they slammed gears and shattered the fragile final drives. The machine died where it stood. How did a long-range sniper survive the dense forests of Normandy? It didn't. The doctrine demanded a distance of 2 kilometers. The reality was a knife fight in the bocage. The commander was the brain of the tank, but he was blind. To see anything, he had to stand waist-deep in the hatch. Exposed. A target for every sniper and shrapnel burst. Inside, he wasn't just commanding, he was wrestling 50-pound shells to help the loader. The system collapsed. The heavy tank destroyer battalions were meant to sit behind the main force. They needed infantry to guard their flanks. They needed space. Instead, Berlin threw them into urban meat grinders and narrow village streets. The Allies stopped attacking them head-on. They simply mapped the Jagd Panther's position and waited. Then came the artillery. Then came the rocket-firing Typhoons. Elite crews executed perfect ambushes, stacking dozens of Allied wrecks in minutes. It didn't matter. Without fuel or support, the crews climbed out, set the charges, and blew their own machines to pieces. While the machines in Normandy failed due to mechanical breakdown, the Eastern Front saw a different kind of execution. Soldiers of the 563rd Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion did not wait for Soviet shells. They carried explosive charges. The tank was a predator, but the cabin was a trap. Inside the Jagd Panther, space was a luxury the loader did not have. When the 88mm gun fired, the breech recoiled with the force of a falling hammer. One wrong step. 1 second of hesitation. The massive steel block would pin a leg or an arm against the rear wall. A wet crunch of bone followed the roar of the cannon. Inexperienced crews, rushed to the front with weeks of training, bled out on the floor of their own tanks. The tragedy of the 563rd was not a lack of skill, but a lack of oil. In a single engagement, they decimated the enemy, knocking out 53 Soviet tanks. A tactical masterpiece, but the aftermath was a funeral. 12 Jagd Panthers sat silent, their tanks dry, their gears stripped by terrified drivers. The crews climbed out, set the fuses, and watched their pride turn into a scorched skeleton. Individual heroism changed nothing. One lone hunter held an entire Soviet armored column, turning 12 tanks into pillars of smoke. Then the ammunition ran out. The driver floored the pedal, but the engine sputtered and died. The crew burned the vehicle and walked into the woods. In the final months, the German army destroyed more of its own elite armor than the Allies ever could. 12. That was the number of functional Jag Panthers the 563rd Battalion had to blow up with their own hands. Those same empty fuel tanks and shattered roads of winter 1944 halted the deployment of the 80 completed Jag Tigers. The heavy tank destroyer was a masterpiece of overkill. Its 1,280mm shells could vaporize any Allied tank from 2 kilometers. Yet the weapon was a prisoner of its own weight. How did 75 tons of steel fail to reach the front? The answer lay in the ruins of the Reich's infrastructure. Allied bombers systematically dismantled the factories. Production lines stopped. Spare parts vanished. To move these monsters, the Wehrmacht needed specialized 6-axle heavy-duty rail platforms. Most had already been twisted into scrap metal by air raids. The Ardennes offensive moved forward, but the Jag Tigers stayed behind. The rail network was a corpse. If a machine did manage to unload, it often broke down within miles. Transmission gears sheared under the immense strain of the march. The superweapon was being defeated by physics and logistics before firing a single shot. In the final chaos of the retreat, a train hissed to a halt near the front lines. Steel ramps hit the ground with a bone-shaking thud. Giant, angular hulls crawled out of the steam, their massive cannons pointing at the gray sky. German soldiers stared in silence. None of them had ever seen these machines before. 4 Jag Tigers crawled into the tree line near Chaumont. They waited, engines cut. Only the sound of the freezing wind remained. In front of them stretched a wide, open field, a perfect killing zone. Soon, the American vanguard appeared. M4 Sherman tanks spearheaded the column, oblivious to the steel giants watching from the ridge. The German crews held their breath. They waited for the Americans to fill the center of their sights. Then, the frost-shattered air erupted. The roar of the 128mm guns was deafening. It didn't just sound like artillery. It sounded like the world was tearing apart. A massive muzzle flash scorched the snow. One Sherman disintegrated, then another. The massive shells punched through the American armor as if it were wet cardboard. Smoke and fire choked the valley. Within minutes, 11 Shermans were burning wrecks. Others scrambled into reverse, desperate to escape the invisible executioners. Did this tactical slaughter change the map? Not even slightly. Patton's Third Army commanded thousands of tanks. For the Americans, the loss of a platoon was a minor delay, a localized tactical setback. For the Reich, it was a momentary flicker of power in a dying furnace. The giants remained unscathed. Not a single scratch marked their thick hide. They successfully supported the infantry and stalled the relief of American troops. Patton's advance slowed to a crawl. British engineers walked through the silent halls of captured German factories. The war was over. Outside, the ruins of the Reich still smoldered, but inside, the Royal Engineers were already at work. They didn't just study the blueprints, they ordered the assembly of nearly a dozen new Jag Panthers from leftover parts. The goal was simple: evaluation. London wanted to know if these turretless monsters had a future. They shipped the machines across the channel. Steel giants that once haunted the Ardennes were now test subjects on British soil. Did the concept survive? No. The Jag Panther was a dead end. The era of the specialized fixed-gun tank destroyer had vanished. New steel was rising. The British Centurion and the American M48 Patton proved that one machine could do it all. A rotating turret combined the roles of light, medium, and heavy tanks. Versatility killed the specialist. Today, the terror of 1945 is a museum curiosity. Only 10 Jag Panthers remain in the entire world. One of them sits behind the ropes at the Bovington Tank Museum. 4 others have been restored to running condition, their engines occasionally roaring for crowds across Europe. In early 1944, a 70-ton armored monster crushed an ancient stone bridge in Italy and plummeted into the ravine below. The Roman masonry disintegrated. It was the first casualty of the elephant's arrival, occurring before the enemy was even in sight. The German command was desperate to stop the Allied landings at Anzio. They threw their heaviest steel at a landscape of soft soil and narrow mountain passes. Why send a 70-ton tank to the narrow, winding roads of Italy? Berlin needed a wall of fire to plug the gaps after the Allied invasion. But the infrastructure of the Mediterranean became a graveyard for German engineering. One elephant slid off a rain-soaked hillside road. 70 tons of dead weight settled into the mud. No recovery vehicle in the theater could budge it. The crew set the explosive charges and watched their pride vanish in a cloud of cordite. The survivors eventually reached the front lines near Rome. From defensive positions, the long 88mm guns worked. American Shermans brewed up at ranges where they couldn't even see the muzzle flashes. But the tactical victories were hollow. The air belonged to the Allies. The P-47 Thunderbolt appeared as a speck in the blue Italian sky. Then came the scream of the radial engine. 2 elephants were torn open by 500-pound bombs. The crews lived in a state of permanent vibration and fear. If a track snapped or a transmission seized, the machine was a monument to failure. One of these intact giants was later loaded onto a ship, destined for testing grounds in the United States, to be poked and prodded by Allied engineers. The retreat became a series of controlled explosions. Men who had spent months maintaining the complex engines now turned their tools into demolition kits. They jammed grenades into the breaches and ignited the fuel tanks. The crews blew up their own functional machines and began the long walk north on foot. The chaos in the Italian mountains didn't start with a broken bridge. It began in 1940 in the quiet offices of German engineers. Ferdinand Porsche had a vision. He wanted to replace heavy mechanical gears with electricity. His design used 2 gasoline engines to drive massive generators. These generators fed electric motors. No complex transmission, no shifting gears. In theory, it was the future of warfare. In reality, it was a copper and steel furnace. The air in the testing bay turned thick. You could smell the ozone. Then the stench of melting insulation. Then the acrid smoke of scorched copper as the generators hit their limit. Adolf Hitler demanded a miracle for his birthday in April 1942. He wanted a tank to carry the legendary 88mm flak gun. Porsche presented his petrol-electric monster. Henschel presented a traditional, rugged machine. The demonstration was a disaster for Porsche. His prototype overheated and seized, while the Henschel design hummed with mechanical reliability. Hitler made his choice. The Henschel tank became the Tiger I. Porsche's ego had already cost the Reich dearly. He was so certain of victory that he had ordered the assembly of 100 chassis before the contract was even signed. This was hundreds of tons of high-alloy Krupp steel. It was a mountain of wasted man-hours in a collapsing economy. 70 tons of combat weight made the machine a prisoner of the road. The Ministry of Armaments refused to scrap the hulls. They ordered the chassis to be converted into heavy tank destroyers. They welded massive superstructures onto the failed frames and fitted the long 88mm gun. The High Command officially canceled the original Porsche Tiger project. A single bazooka rocket strikes the rear armor. The shaped charge cuts through steel. White-hot metal jets hit the ammunition racks. The Jag Tiger vanishes in a pillar of fire. The same lethal ambition that birthed the failed Porsche chassis led to this monster. It first entered the meat grinder in January 1945. Operation Nordwind was supposed to be a triumph. It became a graveyard. What was more terrifying for heavy armor than an enemy shell? A fragile transmission and bone-dry fuel tanks. The giants couldn't move. Allied bombers smashed the rail lines, forcing the 70-ton beasts onto the roads. The mechanical heart of the Jag Tiger wasn't built for marches. Gears stripped. Engines seized. When the fuel ran out or the tracks snapped, the crews did the only thing left. They set the charges. They blew up their own invincible machines to keep them out of American hands. The veterans were gone. By 1945, the hatches were manned by boys. Inexperienced, terrified, they knew the end was coming. One commander spotted a Sherman from a perfect hold-down position. He fired. The American tank erupted. But when return fire rattled against the frontal plate, panic took over. He ordered the driver to turn and flee. He exposed the thin side armor to the enemy. 1 hit, 5 deaths. Civilians watched from the ruins. They whispered to Allied scouts about the ambushes ahead. The Americans didn't charge. They picked up the radio. Airstrikes turned the narrow roads into steel traps before a single Allied tank moved forward. The math of the Reich had failed. One Jagdtiger cost as much as 30 Hetzer tank destroyers. 30 small mobile hunters could cover 30 kilometers of front. One Jagdtiger could barely hold a single crossroads. Germany built nearly 3,000 Hetzers during the war. They only managed to assemble around 88 Jagdtigers. 30 Hetzers for the price of one Jagdtiger.
The illusion of invincibility began with the Ferdinand. It was a mobile fortress, a 200mm steel wall. This wasn't just a tank, it was a statement. Engineers took the infamous 88mm caliber from the Tiger I and mutated it. The new L-71 gun carried nearly double the propellant charge. The barrel grew longer, muzzle velocity reached extreme levels. It became the most lethal anti-tank weapon in the German arsenal. On paper, it was a god of war. It could vaporize the heaviest Allied armor from over 2,000 yards. At that distance, the enemy could only watch. Returning effective fire was a dream they couldn't afford. The machine bore the name of its creator, Ferdinand Porsche. It was a tribute to his genius, but the name wouldn't last. Later, the military rushed to rename the upgraded version Elephant. They needed to sever the link between the designer and the early design's catastrophic failure. Why rename a masterpiece? To save a reputation from the coming embarrassment. The protection was absolute. 200mm of frontal armor made the Ferdinand impervious to any Allied gun in existence. It was nearly twice the thickness of the already legendary Tiger I. Even the sides carried 80mm of steel. Solid. Formidable. It was a weapon built for one place, the Eastern Front. Specifically, the open graveyards of Kursk. In theory, the Ferdinand would sit on the horizon and pick off Soviet tanks with surgical precision. It was designed for a clean, long-range duel. Steel rang like a bell as Allied shells bounced harmlessly off the frontal plate. The crews felt untouchable. But the plan for the massive spring offensive was already rotting. The plan failed. Behind 200mm of frontal steel, the Ferdinand crews were blind and defenseless against simple Soviet infantry. The machine was a fortress. But it was a fortress without a single machine gun. How do you destroy the Reich's most protected monster? You just walk up to it. The hull lacked a 7.92mm MG-34. Engineering logic dictated that infantry would shield the tank. Reality dictated otherwise. The massive silhouette attracted every Soviet shell in the sector. German grenadiers refused to stand near the magnet for heavy artillery. They stayed far behind. The Ferdinand was left alone. Soviet soldiers ran toward the blind spots. One infantryman climbed the rear deck. He smashed a Molotov cocktail over the engine grating. Fire sucked into the intakes. Inside, the situation was a slow suffocation. The fighting compartment was spacious but lethal. After every shot from the 88, acrid powder gases filled the air. The heat became unbearable. The smell of burning oil and sweat mixed with the roar of the mid-mounted engines. Exhaustion broke the men before the machines failed. Crews fought all day. They spent the entire night hauling heavy wrenches to assist mechanics. No sleep. Then, they drove back into the smoke of the Kursk salient. The ultimate predator finally met its match. The Soviets deployed the Su-152. It was a brutal counter. In one engagement, a massive 152mm howitzer shell struck the Ferdinand directly. The heavy steel hit the rails in April 1943. 2 battalions, 90 machines in total. The crews had only weeks to master the most complex tank destroyer in the world. There was no time for finesse. Operation Citadel was the target. The German High Command bet everything on the Kursk salient. They deployed 89 Ferdinands, every functional unit in existence. The machines were loaded onto flatbeds and hauled east into the dust of the Russian steppe. Success felt inevitable during the first hours. The long 71 caliber guns found targets 2 kilometers away. Soviet T-34s erupted in flames before they could even spot their killers. Anti-tank shells and heavy rounds from Soviet batteries struck the 200mm frontal plates.
They simply bounced off. But the victory was a mirage. The Red Army had turned the open fields into a meat grinder. Did the Germans realize they were driving into the most sophisticated defense in history? Soviet engineers had laid hundreds of thousands of mines. They dug anti-tank ditches and positioned hidden artillery every few meters. The defense went back dozens of kilometers. The giants moved forward without minesweepers. The earth began to scream. One by one, the 70-ton monsters shuddered as their tracks disintegrated. The invincible armor didn't matter when the machine couldn't move. The first day ended with a grim record of 22 Soviet tanks destroyed. 12 tanks remained. Out of 89 machines deployed for Operation Citadel, only 12 were still breathing after a few days. The rest were not slain by Soviet shells, they were strangled by their own complexity. Porsche's gasoline-electric drive was a high-tech nightmare. 2 engines, 2 generators, and a cluster of electric motors were crammed into the hull. The weight was 70 tons. The suspension was fragile. On the road, the Ferdinand reached 18 miles per hour. In the mud, it barely crawled. The official range was 90 kilometers, but few ever saw the end of a fuel tank. Inside the steel box, the heat was suffocating. You could hear the high-pitched whine of overworked electric motors fighting 70 tons of dead weight. Then, the smell of ozone and burning insulation. The electrical system hated water. It hated dust. It hated the reality of the Eastern Front. If a Ferdinand slipped into a ditch or sank in the mire, it was over. Recovery required 5 heavy towing vehicles working in perfect unison. In the heat of retreat, that was a luxury no one had. Crews realized their enemy wasn't the Red Army, but the blueprints of their own engineers. The men didn't wait for the Soviets to close in. They climbed out, set the charges, and watched their indestructible monsters turn into scrap. Most Ferdinands died by the hands of their own mechanics. 39 machines. That was the butcher's bill for the mines and mud of Kursk. Out of 90 original hulls, nearly half were now scrap or abandoned. The survivors retreated to the rear. High Command realized the indestructible monster was blind and defenseless in a close fight. The fix was a series of desperate patches. Engineers cut a hole in the front armor to install a hull machine gun. It was a basic necessity. Every standard German tank had one since 1939. To fix the tunnel vision, they bolted a commander's cupola onto the roof. The view from the hatch had been a death sentence. Now the crew could finally see the infantry flanking them. The name Ferdinand was tainted by failure. It smelled of burnt engines and wasted steel. To bury the past, Berlin renamed the machine the Elephant. It was a cosmetic rebranding for a fundamental disaster. New projects like the Panther and Tiger were already on the horizon to carry the 88mm guns. But these were paper dreams for an army running out of time. The refit program was still underway when the Mediterranean front collapsed. Allied boots hit the sand at Anzio. There was no time for more testing. The heavy battalions loaded their newly christened elephants onto rail platforms and headed for Italy. Upgraded hulls and new names changed nothing for the exhausted crews on the Eastern Front. They faced a new terror from 3 kilometers away. The Soviet 152mm howitzer shells didn't need to pierce the armor. The sheer kinetic energy of a 40-kilogram projectile turned the interior into a lethal, vibrating chamber. Tannoy speakers screamed. Steel groaned. A deafening physical ringing filled the ears of the tankers, a high-pitched scream that never faded after a near miss. The optics were superior. The long-barreled guns were precise. At 3,000 meters, a Ferdinand could still pick apart a Soviet charge before the enemy even saw the muzzle flash. But the machine was dying from within. Reliability plummeted. Out of an entire battalion, only 2 or 3 vehicles were combat-ready at any given moment. The rest sat as dead weight, waiting for parts that never came. The role had shifted. No longer the spearhead, they were now the iron rear guard. They sat in hold-down positions, watching the horizon. Soviet tanks attempted head-on charges and vanished in pillars of black smoke. Frontal penetration was impossible, even at point-blank range. But the Red Army learned. They didn't attack the front, they simply drove around. The crews were breaking. They fought without sleep, moving from one collapsing sector to the next. Commanders sent frantic radio messages to headquarters. They begged for 48 hours of maintenance. They needed to clear the cooling fans and tighten the tracks. The response from the high command was always the same: refused. Every operational gun was needed to plug the holes in a front line that was melting away. The mechanics watched the machines crawl past, their engines screaming in protest. The German army was in full retreat. The front slowly crumbled. The retreat never stopped. By the spring of 1945, the myth of the miracle weapon lay buried in the thick black mud of the Eastern Front. These 70-ton monsters were designed for breakthrough, but now they were just overheating iron boxes sinking into the earth. The radiators choked on dust and debris. The tracks churned the slush in place. Only 4 semi-operational elephants remained to guard the southern approaches to Berlin. Imagine the scene on April 22, 1945. The crews look through their periscopes. They see a horizon of Soviet steel. 2 elephants open fire, their 88mm guns barking in a final rhythmic defiance. Then, silence. The engines seized. The transmissions snapped. The crews climbed out, set the charges, and watched their steel fortresses vanish in a cloud of cordite. The last 2 survivors crawled into the ruins of the capital. They took up positions among the shattered brick and skeletal buildings. They managed to knock out several Soviet assault guns. It was a tactical victory in a strategic graveyard. The end was mechanical and cold. Overrun and out of ammunition, the final 2 crews destroyed their vehicles from the inside. They walked into captivity, leaving behind a project that cost millions and changed nothing. Today, the entire history of the Ferdinand and Elephant is reduced to just 2 surviving machines. One sits in a museum in Russia, the other in the United States.